afternoon, good evening to everyone joining the webinar. As Val mentioned, I'm Shikrupa. I am a Senior Product Marketing Manager for Security Solutions at Infoblox. And today I'm going to kind of cover our new product that we just launched a couple of months ago called Infoblox Internal DNS Security. And we'll take a look at some of the capabilities of that product, some of the problems that it solves, and also some of the case studies that we have. So I know this is a customer audience, so we want to thank you guys for being our customers. And the focus for today's webinar is the security product that I mentioned. And I know you guys know Infoblox has been in the DDI space for quite a while. We are the industry leader in the DDI space. And a couple of years ago, we launched into a DNS security-based portfolio of products, and it's been doing really, really well. And part of the reason is the threat landscape, right? And we'll take a look at what that looks like, but more increasingly, DNS is becoming a threat vector. And recent reports suggest that DNS is the #1 attack vector for application layer attacks. It's the #1 attack used for reflection amplification, etc. So lots of security technologies out there, but none of them completely address DNS. And Infoblox is filling that critical gap in your network infrastructure. As Val mentioned, feel free to submit your questions through the chat, through the Q&A window, and I will answer all of them towards the end of the presentation. So with that, let's take a look at the threats that we see today, right? And you might have heard of all the top news items about target breaches, so many high-profile data breaches that we've seen today. So what that means is CIOs and CISOs are now more than ever concerned about APTs malware, about data theft, about network downtime. Some of these are more of a concern for CIOs. For example, network downtime, they have to keep the infrastructure up and running, application availability, service availability, etc. is the top concern. When you think about CISOs, they're more concerned about things like data breaches. They want to make sure that their company doesn't get on the front pages for a data breach, right? And we've seen a lot of the cases where it's become almost critical to their job function to make sure that all their security holes are plugged. And this is top concerns for CIOs today. There was a recent UBS survey that said that security remains the #1 issue for CIOs. So no surprise there, just validation that the threat landscape is evolving and keeps these people up at night. When Infoblox talks to some of our customers, some of the trends we've been finding over the last few months is attacks and threats that actually affect a DNS server inside a network. So it's not just your internet-facing DNS server that's subject to cyber attacks that can bring it down or cause a DDoS, but more increasingly, we've seen cases where a malicious insider or an infected endpoint ends up launching a denial-of-service attack on internal DNS servers. And it could just use the DNS server to launch attacks on other network assets in the organization. One example was a large North American healthcare company, and they experienced about 1 million queries per second from an infected endpoint to their internal DNS. This caused the outage. Obviously there was downtime, lost productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a real customer example. And then another customer we talked to, which is a large developer of video games, and they had malware inside the network that was actually trying to exfiltrate data through DNS. And there are different ways to do that. There are different techniques to use DNS to exfiltrate data. And this particular example, in this particular example, the malware was so sophisticated that it was using a really, really hard to detect low volume exfiltration technique over DNS. So it did not raise any red flags right away, and it was really hard to detect because they used spoofed addresses. And then the third example I want to talk about is a large automaker. And when we were in talks with this company, the CSO was mainly concerned with data exfiltration and data loss. And Infoblox actually did a POC showing them how we can detect DNS tunneling and data exfiltration over DNS tunneling. And it was very successful. They were immediately happy that we were able to plug that gap through DNS, and the company is very keen on purchasing our product for detection of data exfiltration or DNS tunneling. In fact, I think they just bought our product a couple of weeks ago. So really, really recent, relevant examples that showcase that you know, if your DNS is not secure, your data is not secure, your infrastructure could go down due to attacks, and basically you are left vulnerable to these type of security threats. So these targeted attacks pose a threat not only to your infrastructure but also to your data. When you look at DNS attacks specifically, there are a whole different, there are a whole bunch of attacks, a whole spectrum. Those on the left that you see here, reflection, amplification, floods, these are all your typical volumetric attacks that have been increasingly targeting internal resources and not just your internet-facing DNS. There are things like NX domain, phantom domain, random subdomain, or slow dip attack. These are more sophisticated, stealthy, and hence hard to detect, and they all, you know, cause some sort of denial of service on your internal DNS. The ones on the right are more of exploits and techniques that exploit the DNS protocol itself. So they could be like malformed packets or DNS tunneling, as I talked about earlier, cache poisoning. These are all DNS protocol specific exploits that can also cause the server to crash or cause a slow response. So, you know, it's not just your typical basic flood attacks, but there are a whole bunch of sophisticated attacks as well, and they keep evolving. And they keep evolving their techniques and their methodology, and staying one step ahead of these attackers is key. So we talked about attacks. Now let's take a look at APTs and malware. APTs, or advanced persistent threats as they're called, are you know, really sophisticated types of malware that stay in the network for long periods of time without being detected, and they avoid a lot of the traditional and next-gen firewalls. They somehow get inside the network, and you know, they linger on for a long time. And the time it takes to identify that an infection has happened and to identify the infected device is critical, because if that time is too long, then in that period there could be data exfiltration happening, or there could be other malicious software that's being downloaded on the endpoints. So the time to detection is critical, and there was a recent survey that said that, a recent survey by Cisco that said that malicious traffic is visible on 100% of the networks or the corporations that they survey. So everybody has malware. It's not a question of if, but it's a question of when you will get breached with malware, and how fast and how effectively you can respond is critical. Once malicious host enters your network, every minute the infected endpoint could be accessing a malicious website on the internet. It could be downloading software. It could be exfiltrating data. A lot of things, right? And about 80 to 85% of these types of malware and APTs use DNS as a communication path. And the reason being, directly trying to communicate to the bad domains through IP address is easy to detect and block by firewalls. But when you think about DNS, they use DNS name resolving mechanism to avoid detection, and APTs rely on DNS at various stages of the cyber kill chain. So having a DNS-based solution is important in this case. Some examples of malware that we've seen that keep cropping up every now and then and very popular. Maybe the attackers use different variations of these as malware, but these are very popular. CryptoLocker, this is also called ransomware, and in this case it encrypts files on a hard drive and then asks for a ransom to get the data back. And again, this is a malware that uses DNS to download the encryption software as well as exfiltrate data and things like that. So a really DNS-based malware that can cause significant damage. The second one is game over's use. This is actually a botnet that is used to drop in malware like CryptoLocker, etc. And this again, variants of game over's use have been cropping up so often that it's become a daily affair. And last year there were about 1 million infections globally, especially targeting financial institutions, and hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen. The U.S. Department of Justice raised a red flag, and they kind of warned people about this, and the government took down some of the sites that are associated with game over's use, but it was a temporary takedown, right? It came back up in different form and factor, and I saw an article this morning about a variant of game over's use. So really persistent type of malware that's out there. So let's talk about data breaches and DNS. There was a recent survey that SC Magazine reported on, and 46%, this survey was done on 300 enterprise IT users in both North America and Europe. And 46% of those respondents said that they experienced some sort of DNS-based data exfiltration, right? And 45 of them came back and said they experienced DNS tunneling. So data breach through DNS is becoming a common trend, and it could be done in a couple of ways. Just set up a DNS tunnel and then send the sensitive information out. And some of the more sophisticated techniques involve using host and subdomain records and embedding data directly in the DNS queries themselves. So a few different variations, but they all use DNS for data breach. And this is something that traditional DLP solutions don't necessarily look at, right? They don't look at DNS specifically, and so your traditional DLP solutions may not be sufficient. I talked about DNS tunneling being used as a covert mechanism for bypassing firewalls and for exfiltrating data. Typically, attackers tunnel protocols like SSH or web within DNS. It can easily pass stolen data. It can be also used as a full way of remote control channel for a compromised internal host. So very straightforward, very easy to do, and you can also exfiltrate data or drop in additional malicious software through the DNS tunnel. And this is a simple way of establishing a tunnel where you can exfiltrate data. But a more complicated way involves embedding the data directly in the DNS queries itself. So the way that this works is if an infected endpoint gets access to a malicious software, then it will, if an infected endpoint gets access to a file containing sensitive data, what it does is it breaks up that data into different smaller chunks. It will encode it in a hex code or some sort of a format, and it will append it directly to the DNS queries themselves that are going out to destinations outside. And the DNS server will recurse these queries out, because that's what a server is built to do. So it recurses these queries out. The destination is, say, thief.com, which is a domain controlled by the attacker. So now thief.com server is getting these DNS queries with the actual data embedded. Yes, it's encoded, so it can decode it at its end and put that data back together. And it does this, this process happens in smaller chunks, so it's hard to detect. And the infected endpoint also uses spoofed IP addresses, so you can't trace it back to that endpoint. So when multiple endpoints form a botnet, and then they exfiltrate this data in low volume from each of those endpoints, so it becomes harder to detect. So this is an advanced kind of data exfiltration over DNS that we've seen recently. So, the bottom line is we saw examples of attacks. We saw APT malware examples. We saw data exfiltration and how that can happen over DNS. And the bottom line is DNS is one of the fastest growing attack vectors, right? It's a UDP-based protocol, very trusting. It was not built with security in mind, and it's an easy to exploit protocol. So traditional technologies don't necessarily focus on DNS threats, and there's also this whole proliferation of BYOD devices, Internet of Things. Everything is getting connected these days, right? And which means many of these threats are brought into the network and they're behind the firewall. So having a DNS-based solution, DNS is a ubiquitous protocol. Its position in the network is optimal to detect these type of threats, right? So it becomes this optimal enforcement point. And that's what we're trying to say. We're trying to say that using a DNS-based security solution is important to fill that gap and to catch these sophisticated techniques that could actually cause significant damage and convert this DNS, which could be an Achilles heel, into a security asset in your organization. So I think I want to do a quick poll now to find out, to ask you guys if you've had any internal DNS server outages, or are you concerned about any type of internal DNS server outages happening. I'll give you about 10 seconds to answer. So, okay, about 20% of you have said you've had some internal outages. 80% have said no, which is fine. If you haven't had any outages, that's great. But it never hurts to kind of be prepared for when it may happen, as you've seen from some of our examples. So I laid out the threat landscape, and I want to talk about what Infoblox can do, what we offer to mitigate these type of DNS-based threats. And we just launched a solution, and I'll go into that. But our approach has been threefold, right? Infoblox's security approach is visibility, protection, and response. Visibility meaning making sure that you can see any attacks that might be happening, you can see any infection points and data exfiltration attempts that may be happening in the network. So if you can't see it, you can't protect it. So making sure that you see that before you can start the protection. Now, from the protection angle, Infoblox can protect a network from infrastructure attacks inside the network. It can detect these APTs malware communication attempts to bad domains. It can also detect and contain any data exfiltration attempts that may be happening. And then finally, response, right? So with the Infoblox's DHCP fingerprinting and some of the other reporting server capabilities, we can identify the infected endpoint and also tell you the exact username that endpoint is assigned to, so you can immediately go and get hold of the endpoint and do any remediation, right? And we also work with industry standard ecosystem partners to accelerate mitigation and response. Okay. So the solution we're talking about today is called Internal DNS Security, and we just launched it about a couple of months ago. And this is a comprehensive DNS security solution for protecting your data and your network and your infrastructure inside an enterprise, right? So the first thing it offers is resilient network infrastructure. What does that mean? It's a DNS server. Internal DNS Security is an internal DNS server that has security built in, that has detection capabilities built in, that can detect any attacks, any DNS DDoS attacks or other types of attack, cache poisoning, tunneling, etc. And it will drop those attacks, right? It will not respond to any attack traffic. It will respond only to the legitimate DNS queries, or it will recurse out only the legitimate DNS queries, and it will drop any attacks. And it also does it through a hardware accelerated mechanism. So there is an additional processing built into the server, built into the appliance that can pre-process the queries and drop the attacks. So it doesn't affect the performance of the DNS server, even under extreme attack. The second benefit the internal DNS security offers is protection against APTs and malware. I talked about how APTs work and some examples of malware. And what internal DNS security does is it can stop this propagation and can stop infected endpoints from communicating to its command and control sites on the internet with the DNS firewall capability. So there's a list of known bad domains that it uses, and that list, the RPZ feed list, and it keeps constantly getting updated through automated threat intelligence feeds. So there's nothing that the administrator needs to do on his end. It's automated, and the protection stays up to date. When new bad domains are identified, those are added to the blacklist automatically. So having that communication blocked from an infected endpoint is critical to preventing the spread of malware and for easy identification. The third feature that this offers is protection against data exfiltration. And the way it does that is twofold. One is it can detect any DNS tunneling attempts. So if there's any DNS tunneling happening, there are rules in there that can detect DNS tunneling. Both types of DNS tunneling, both low volume DNS tunneling attempts as well as high volume brute force attempts. So it can prevent any data exfiltration that can potentially happen through that DNS tunnel. And all this capability that internal DNS security provides is native to the DNS server. So there's no additional endpoint agents that need to be deployed on your endpoints. There's no additional software that needs to be deployed. There's no changes to your network architecture. It's all part of the DNS server. And everybody has an internal DNS server. All you need to do is leverage that internal DNS server to protect your network against attacks. Just to give you an idea of what the deployment may look like, internal DNS security sits behind the firewall inside your network. All legitimate queries are recursed out. If there's DDoS attacks, they are blocked. If there's data exfiltration attempts, they are blocked. And if a malicious site is, if there's an infected endpoint trying to communicate to a bad site, that gets blocked, right? And again, as I mentioned, the feed updates the appliance every 2 hours, so you stay up to date against evolving attacks and new bad domains. I mentioned protection against internal DNS attacks. Again, just some examples of what those attacks are and how the internal DNS security can block those attacks and recurse out only the legitimate queries. When you look at APTs Malware, let's say an infected endpoint is brought into the office, it spreads to other devices, and then it tries to call home, right? It tries to call its command and control site on the internet. The internal DNS security blocks that communication. It also pinpoints the actual endpoint that's infected, right? So it'll give you a lot of identifying information about the endpoint, like IP address, MAC address, host name. It also gives you the username. So it'll give you the username of who that infected endpoint is assigned to. So you can easily go track it down and track the device down and do remediation. The automatic updates gets happens every 2 hours. And then we also work, as I mentioned, we also work with industry standard partners, right? Industry standard technologies like FireEye, sandboxing technology. So we get intelligence from the FireEye NX series, and we can add that to the block list. So if FireEye identifies a particular domain as associated with APTs, we can add that to our list and block any attempted communications to those bad domains as well. And we are offering, we are expanding our ecosystem to other technologies as well. So things that we can protect against, fast flux. Fast flux is when the domains keep changing their identity rapidly to avoid detection. So we can get that information as well. Domain generation algorithms. This is the other side of the equation where the infected endpoint uses certain algorithms to constantly try to connect to a bad domain. We can detect those type of things. You can also do geo-blocking if your organization does not do any business with a particular country or geographic location. You can block that. You can block all access to that geographical location. And I talked about DNS tunneling, so it can protect against both low-volume attempts as well as high-volume brute force. And the way the internal DNS security does that is there's a whole bunch of signatures, DNS tunneling signatures, that we use to detect any attempts using really common DNS tunneling tools, really well-known off-the-shelf DNS tunneling tools that are out there. we can detect and block that attempt. We also look at certain sizes of the queries and responses. If there are too many large type of TXT records in a given time frame, it could indicate a DNS tunneling attempt, so we can detect and block that beyond certain thresholds. All right, so time for another polling question before I wrap up. So have you experienced any data exfiltration attempt in your organization? Feel free to answer the question in about 10 seconds. We will see the results. So it looks like about 53% of you guys are concerned with data exfiltration or have experienced some sort of data exfiltration. And this is typical. Last week when I did a webinar, I saw about 60% that responded that they have experienced data exfiltration or are concerned. Increasingly, we see this as a big threat, and this is consistent with some of the responses. So thank you for that. And then I just want to wrap up with our reporting. I mentioned earlier we have a lot of detailed and contextual-based reporting that we offer to identify infected devices, to find out where the attacks are happening on the network. We also have user identity mapping, as I mentioned, so you can tell which user is assigned to an infected device. And then we also have C-level reports, executive reports that you can take to your management to show them what's happening in terms of security threats on the network. In terms of the actual form factors for internal DNS security, we have 3 platforms to choose from depending on your needs. The smallest one being 1400, and then it goes all the way up to 4000. The 4000 comes in 1 gig and 10 gig E options. Some examples of customer wins. This was a recent one. There's a large technology company here in the Bay Area, and they were running internal DNS using their virtual environment, VMware. And something happened. They could not find out what happened, but their DNS went down. There was a 4-hour outage, and they had to send all their North American employees home. So really, really affected the productivity. And there was some sort of attacks happening on the DNS, and they decided to go with internal DNS security. So they bought the product with reporting. So they've decided to separate their DNS services from all the other application services, right? So separation of services and better protection against DDoS is what they achieved, and also comprehensive security for their DNS. Another example, a large insurance company, they had a malware-borne attack on internal DNS. I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. They had redundancy problems, etc. And they want to get rid of Patch Tuesday. They didn't want to keep doing this patching every week for security and all of that. So they wanted a more automated, a more integrated solution, and a more complete solution for internal DNS. And they bought the DNS security product, and they were able to maximize uptime. The final one is a large automaker. I mentioned this earlier. Their CSO was really concerned about losing their private data that actually gave them an edge over their rivals. So they were worried about competitive information or their own competitive advantage leaking out. So they were really concerned about that. We showed them how we can protect them against a DNS tunneling type of data exfiltration attempts. They bought the internal DNS security product and reporting. So what can you do? I want to kind of quickly end with what can you do to make sure that your DNS is protected. The first step is to find out if you are vulnerable, right? See if there are any DNS threats in your network. And we offer a couple of easy ways to do that. Actually, this is the easiest way to do that, right? Contact your Infoblox team, contact the Infoblox account rep or your SE, and send about 20 minutes of the DNS traffic trace that you have, right? And Infoblox team will run it through our labs to analyze the data or the PCAP files and see if there's any malicious activity going on. They also will give you a really nice detailed report that you can take back to management. There's some examples of stuff we found when we did this type of PCAP analysis. There was a large automotive parts company where we found CryptoLocker. There are cases where we found over 2,000 DNS queries to malicious sites. And 8 of them were in the most malicious category. And then in one case, we actually found 15 hits to malicious sites within just 1 minute of the DNS traffic trace. So really, it's been very, very effective, the PCAP analysis process that we offer to our customers. So feel free to take advantage of that, and you can find out if you have any malicious activity going on. So with that, I think we're just about at the end of the webinar time, but I want to answer a few questions before we wrap up. So there is a question about blocking endpoints from contacting APT, CNC, and malware is outbound. That's correct, and is controlled by RTZ. That's correct on the name server. But what controls inbound DOS and DDoS? So that's a great question. So this webinar was about internal DNS security, but we do offer another product called external DNS security that can detect inbound DDoS attacks from the internet. So the external DNS security is actually an internet-facing DNS server that has the same attack protection capability built in. It's the same platform. It pre-processes the DDoS attacks coming. It processes everything coming in, all the DNS queries. It'll drop all the DDoS attempts, and it'll respond only to the legitimate DNS queries coming in. So that solution is called external DNS security. The second question is how to check a network for DNS loopholes to present a case to management. So great question again. There are a couple of ways you can do that. One, as I mentioned, is do a DNS traffic trace and send us a DNS traffic trace, maybe 20 minutes, that can show you that there's malicious activity going on in the network, and you can take that back to management. The second one is we do offer a free DNS advisor tool on our website, and you can find them under the downloads tab. The DNS advisor tool, there are two kinds. One is one that can test your external internet-facing DNS server. That gives you a report of, and it's a very comprehensive report when you run that test. It'll give you a list of all the configurations that you've done correctly and any vulnerabilities or any security issues or security-related things that are not configured correctly in your DNS network environment. It'll give you that information as well. So that's called the DNS advisor. And then we also have a version of the DNS advisor tool for internal DNS, and your SE can help you with that as well. So a couple of ways that you can check your network for loopholes, and you can present the case to management. And both these ways will give you a nice report that you can take back to management. Let's see. What separates you from another vendor such as OpenDNS? Again, good question, especially in the light of the recent news where Cisco bought OpenDNS. So OpenDNS solves different problems when you compare to Infoblox, right? OpenDNS, there is a little bit of overlap in terms of detecting malware and APT activity. OpenDNS also can do that. It's a cloud-based offering. Infoblox is an on-prem offering. And OpenDNS is actually it works as a DNS proxy. So an organization will forward the DNS queries to the OpenDNS in the cloud, and OpenDNS will look at their queries and then detect any malicious activity. Infoblox, on the other hand, is a complete full DDI solution that can give you enterprise-grade DNS, DHCP, IP address management, as well as some of the security features that you saw today, which not only includes malware APT, but also data exfiltration, also protection against attacks on both an external and internal. So our solution spaces are slightly different, and we are an on-prem solution with a lot more enterprise-grade offerings compared to OpenDNS. OpenDNS sweet spot is kind of mid-market, smaller kind of enterprises use OpenDNS, and again, it's a cloud-based solution. What's the difference between your DNS firewall and internal DNS security products? So great question. DNS firewall is just for the APT malware mitigation, whereas internal DNS security can be thought of as a Cadillac, right? It includes DNS firewall capabilities. It includes the attack protection, DDoS protection capabilities, and it also includes data exfiltration capabilities. So DNS firewall capabilities is a subset of the internal DNS security product line. And the reason we decided to come up with this internal DNS security is a lot of the a lot of the cases in the last few months, we've seen customers buying both our DDoS protection capability as well as DNS firewall, and we decided to kind of offer an integrated product to solve the whole DNS security problem inside an enterprise. I'll probably take a couple of more. Can I use existing Infoblox appliances for internal DNS security? So great question. Internal DNS security is built on our what we call as PT appliances, which are advanced appliances with the DDoS mitigation capability built in. So if you have one of the regular standard Infoblox appliances like Trinsic, then you cannot you can add DNS firewall to it, which is the APT Malware mitigation capability, but you cannot have the attack protection that internal DNS security offers. So yes, you can use existing appliances if you just want APT malware, then you can get the DNS firewall. If you want a more comprehensive DDoS protection and all of that, then you can purchase the internal DNS security product. I'll probably answer one more. When one internal DNS security appliance provides sec for all DNS appliances on my grid, assume correct size appliance is purchased. Okay, so the question is, can one appliance provide security for all DNS appliances on the grid? So if you buy the internal DNS security appliance and put it in a forwarder position, then it can detect APT malware or data exfiltration and protect you against that. But if it's a forwarder configuration, then any downstream DNS servers that are closer to the endpoints, they're not protected against DDoS attempts. So the closer you get to the endpoints, the better protection you get in terms of DDoS protection and APT malware detection and all of that. Because the closer you get to the endpoints, the easier it is to identify which is the infected endpoint with our internal DNS security. So to answer the question, one appliance is not sufficient to protect all the DNS appliances on the grid. You would have to use multiple appliances and have all the endpoints pointing to the internal DNS security appliance. But if replacing everything is not immediately doable, you can put it in a forwarder position. You will get some level of protection and security.